and welcome to our Chartered Bankers Institute International Women's Day webcast. How do we keep EDI in mind all year and not just for International Women's Day? My name's Dr. Iwi Ukiepi-Green and I'm delighted to chair today's session. I'm on my phone because I've had some technical issues, so I'm hoping everything's going to be okay. Hello to those of you who have joined us on previous webcasts, and a warm welcome to everybody. The webcast is being recorded, as you heard, and the link to the recording will be sent to you via email after the session. So please, as Julia said, please do pop any questions that you've got in the chat and we'll try and pick them up during the course of the conversation. Before we start the panel discussion, I'm going to give a bit of overview of EDI in its broadest context before we zoom down into issues that are specific to women. And on that note, I'd just like to give a trigger warning because in the course of our discussions, we might touch on some sensitive themes, such as baby loss and issues relating to women's bodies that some people and viewers might find triggering. So I'm going to just start the session, as I say, with a bit of an overview. There's some accusation that EDI is performative, divisive, and needs a business case for its adoption. And what I would say is that there are some big challenges that are faced by organisations in financial and professional services that have always been rooted, I think, in issues that are sometimes positioned as being competing or conflicting that are related to people, planet and profit. My work and my views are very much rooted in social justice, but from a business position, I do think that EDI should be positioned and framed as a sustainability issue. It's an imperative aspect of business operations and should be a business as usual philosophy. A challenge for organisations is how we move from an underlying principle that we're human first and we treat each other with dignity and equal rights to meaningful, intentional actions that drive change needed to achieve that. Some organisations adopt a position that the law and industry regulations mean that the system will take care of itself. They might not say it, but their actions will demonstrate it. I'm sure there's many of you in the room that can think about proposals where we'll tell there's no budget for EDI, or perhaps where there's a diffusion of responsibility, and EDI becomes everyone's problem or everyone's responsibility until it's no one's responsibility. There's really no real accountability around it. Sometimes at the other end of the spectrum, we might see that companies adopt positions where EDI activities are seen as food, fun, and flag activities, or sometimes as vanity projects that elevate individuals but don't really bring about any real change. There are some who suggest meritocratic systems let the cream rise to the top and that there's no need for EDI and EDI or DEI must die. That it's okay that the World Economic Forum suggests that it's going to take 5 generations for us to reach gender parity in terms of pay, and that it's okay that 18% of people in C-suite are women, and 1.4% of those people are Black women. I would suggest that it's not okay. I also would suggest that I think it's quite insulting to sort of be put to me that I have to present a business case for justification of access to C-suite as a Black, under-resourced or comparatively under-resourced woman. I also feel that I shouldn't have to defend the existence of leadership schemes for Black women, for example, but these are the times that we're in. And these are the normative practices of business. I do think it's good practice to use evidential data to support decision making. So collecting recruitment data, gender pay gap data, promotion stats, etc., to inform our actions. As a lapsed accountant, I would say what gets measured gets done. But I'd also say that data is not just about material things of value, it allocates moral values as well. So my first provocation is, what are the things that are of value to your organisation? How is data being encoded and decoded? What are the preferred meanings that are being ascribed to your data? The stories that dominate, the stories that influence, the stories that malign your EDI action. Whether your organisation believes in its moral values and embodies this through culture, stories, symbols of the firm, or whether as an organisation you choose to just comply with the law, I think the one thing that does unify all stakeholders' expectations is that organisations will comply with the law. But I would also caution that jurisprudence tells us that not all rights are equal. There's a human cost to issues that EDI seeks to address. And when we think about women-related issues, you might think about reproductive rights, maternity and paternity rights, gender pay gaps, recruitment, attraction, retention, progression issues, inequity of opportunity for women. When we think outside of organisations, we might think about financial inclusion of women in the community. I think that EDI provides a lens for us through which we can understand the moral values of organisations. And for me, it's about getting some sense of the prioritisation around people, planet and profit. And today, given the context of International Women's Day, our discussion is going to focus on EDI issues relating to women. I'm delighted to be joined by three fantastic panel members who all have different experience and expertise and therefore insights that they'll bring to the discussion. I'm going to invite Leontia, Julia and David to introduce themselves and then to provide a reflection on what they feel are the pertinent recent changes and perhaps the forthcoming changes that might act as a mechanism or as a catalyst for change. So over to you, Leontia.
Thank you very much, Iwi. I'm delighted to be part of this panel for this afternoon. By way of introduction, I am a legal director in a litigation team of the Manchester office of global law firm DLA Piper. It's through my work that I've had extensive experience in the financial services sector. I tend to be a problem solver, resolving disputes on behalf of many banking organizations. And I do that on a national and cross-jurisdictional global basis. My practice is particularly on mass claims and dealing with sort of consumer issues and consumer rights issues. And it's through that and through my work then that I've also become very involved in the Women in Banking and Finance initiative. So just a little bit about that organization. Since 1980, Women in Banking and Finance has been run as a not-for-profit, volunteer-led organization to promote diversity and gender equality in the financial services sector in the UK. And since 2023, I've been delighted to say that I've been nominated as the co-chair of the Manchester branch of this organisation to promote its events and its ethos to help women progress in their career and achieve their goals. And then just to touch upon one of the themes that you were saying, Iwi, about what we've seen as being a pertinent change. Obviously, DEI has become quite politicised in certain jurisdictions. It's not the same everywhere, and that's what we have to reflect upon, that whilst it has a globalisation and it is a global concept, it has different ramifications in each of our different countries that we operate in. But I would say then that the fact is that DEI has become so high profile and so prominent in discussion could actually be viewed as a promotion for change as well. And that has been seen that it is part of everyday conversation, shows that these issues and this drive for a value-orientated business and working environment has become part and parcel of our everyday working lives. And so I would say that then as a lawyer, obviously conscious of what the legislation and regulatory requirements are, but is also seen as being part of a services orientated industry, that I've seen that there has been real progress and change for diversity and inclusion in our offerings, how we work, how we deliver services. But that's been driven a lot by what our clients want and what our clients see. And because of that, then I think there's real scope for optimism, as well as just that perhaps that scope for concern as well.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Julia.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to be here. My name's Julia Rouse. I'm a professor at Manchester Met University. I actually, for a number of years, was a professor of entrepreneurship, and I'm now a professor of decent work and productivity. And that's because my research has moved on from being about entrepreneurship to being a lot about good people management and EDI innovation. But actually, obviously, my long history in enterprise goes to show the need for us to have diverse workforce in order to serve diverse customers, because we know that the massive underrepresentation of women in entrepreneurship and the issues they've got around accessing finance are reflected by the fact that the organisations they're working with often don't get what their needs, and indeed underestimate them. And so I very much believe that organisations need a diverse workforce in order to serve diverse customers. In relation to the work that I've been doing around organisations, I did a big project on people management, because we all know that how well you're managed determines how well you do your job and how much you enjoy your job, and that there's nothing more painful than having a poor line manager, right? But equally, if you've ever line managed, you know it's really tricky. And it's a skill that is really often underestimated in the way in which we train people, select people, reward people. There's this whole load of reluctant, squeezed managers in the middle of organisations. And pressures like wellbeing and EDI are putting more and more different dilemmas in the laps of those managers. Sometimes organisations haven't strategically resolved any sort of tensions between those and operational pressures. And that tension lies right in the lap of the line manager. And it comes out sometimes as conflict between them and the staff. And we know that line managers get clogged up with all that conflict. So I can see this challenge from the worker's point of view and also from the manager's point of view. And I'm really interested in how do we actually empower managers to practice better, and how do we create contexts where they can practice better? Because as a manager, you can only do what your organisation really enables you to do. And you can only innovate as far as your organisation enables your knowledge to spill over to create projects that would create innovation. So I'm working on two particular projects at the moment. One is across the social housing sector in Greater Manchester. I'm running a project where we're looking at how organisations can change so that ethnically diverse leaders can emerge and thrive. And that's a multi-pronged project that includes a new form of mentoring called disruptive mentoring, a movement for change where we bring people together and really work on their commitment and create a kind of learning lab for change, create a context where we can talk about race at work. And then also change commitments, change projects, change strategies in each organisation. So I'm really interested in how do you change the wider scope of things and also the everyday practice. And I'm also doing a project that I'll probably talk about a bit more today because it's specifically about women, looking at how to create the capability for better workplace maternity management. Shocking statistic last week, 72,000 women a year in the UK lose their job because of pregnancy discrimination, but less than 2,000 take a case to a tribunal. So in a sense, employers are almost free to discriminate. And so there's something very seriously wrong with that. And we've kind of got used to pregnancy being a really tough time at work. And the question is, how can we create a more productive and more compassionate approach to what is, at the end of the day, the awesome task of having babies and perpetuating our species effectively. His other question was, what are the changes that I see? And so I would point to some of the regulatory changes that are going on at the moment. So the current government is going to bring in 2 weeks of, or they're proposing, and it's going through various processes, to bring in 2 weeks of leave in recognition of pregnancy loss. I've had a lot of pregnancy loss myself. I did take some leave. I didn't suffer trauma, and I've gone on to thrive. That short period of leave that I took was highly productive. for my organisation, as well as essential to my well-being. They're also going to offer 12 weeks of leave and pay for neonatal rights, so that if your baby comes prematurely, you have an extra 12 weeks of maternity leave, so that you get the chance to get your baby home, settled, and you get to know your baby before you have to go back to leave, because there were people coming out of neonatal units having to go back to work after having what is quite a traumatic time, really, having a baby in a neonatal unit. And they're also bringing in the right to not be made redundant after you return to work, because of all of those women who are losing their jobs. And the government has also brought in an obligation for organisations to have a proactive approach to preventing sexual harassment. And the thing that I think about this is that we move on and we talk about broader issues of culture and progression, etc., in relation to gender. And I think sometimes it's really worth going back to the basics and issues around the reproductive body. We have a lot of talk about menopause recently, haven't we, which is really valuable. Going back to the reproductive body, I think, is really important to keep in mind when we think about why women feel like space invaders in environments that are shaped really for men traditionally, how much change there is needed to change that, and how we recognise things like sexual harassment haven't gone away. They do still happen. I was watching the news only yesterday about an ambulance driver being sexually harassed by a customer. But if you talk to people in hospitality, for example, it's commonplace. And I expect it happens in banking and financial services. And so organisations now have an obligation to proactively prevent it. And I think that's really positive. Regulation is only part of the problem, part of the solution, because these regulations are raising now issues for organisations. Are they going to pay full pay during neonatal leave, full pay during pregnancy, loss leave, or are they just going to pay the statutory? Are they going to look at their wider policies and create that equity, which I hope they will do, with a view of bringing their talent back so that they can thrive after the maternity period?
Thank you, Julia. Lots of ground covered there. I'm sure we'll come back to some of the issues that you've picked up on there. Thank you. And last but by no means least, over to you, David.
Thanks, Iwi. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is David Nikolic. I'm Managing Director and founder of Abstract, who's a learning development company within the financial service sector. Our involvement with DE&I has started in 2013. We became the financial learning partner for the Financial Times with regards to an exam question that they set us as to why are there so few women in the FTSE 100 C-suite? And that was a difficult question. But just to give you a sort of flavour on what we discovered, in a way, was that it wasn't really about gender. It was about the system supporting the system, and how you were either in traction or you were out of favour. And what we discovered was that the system supporting the system was driving a strong and ruthless behaviour. And our business is all about behavioural change. It's embedding behavioural change. And I've heard from Julia and Leoncia already that talks about, it's about behaviours, it's about culture, it's about all of these things. And that, for me, we've been working with many, many businesses and making a real difference in career management progression for women. But for me, we had this social change that created quotas that said, right, you've got to report your data, you've got to have these quotas. For me, I'm never a fan of quotas, and that's just me. I don't like them. It's tick box mentality. It's I've got bums on seats here, bum, bum, bum. I'm doing well. It's more than that. And we saw today that front page of the Financial Times, the UK watchdog has scrapped the diversity and inclusion rules for financial services firms. So we're moving out of this social agenda which did us well for a while. Even though I don't like quotas, it did us well. It pushed the pendulum just that little bit further forward. And we have made some traction, not by no means enough, but we made some traction. I knew we'd made traction when men were saying to us, well, I'm not going to bother for that promotion because I don't fit the profile. And we would say, you fitted the profile for many years. It's a moment in time, it will pass. We'll get the pendulum back and it'll be an even playing field if indeed you think it's now an uneven playing field. So, but for me now, with the social agenda changing towards a political agenda, I think we're now seeing, sort of the people drinking the Trump Kool-Aid, on a regular basis, and sort of, it's spreading across Europe, and it's very quickly spread into business already, in such a small timeline. So we have to manage that political agenda, and for me, it's counteracting that noise with, keeping that rhetorical speak going. This is just a moment in time. And I agree with Leontia. There are reasons for optimism here. Keep doing what we do. It will come back. It's a moment in time. It won't last forever. And, we're not going away. So for me, moving through social into political change, it will come back probably sooner than we think.
Thanks for that, David. I love that optimism. Yeah, because you can very much get bogged down in the kind of negative, I suppose, in these conversations. And I think you're absolutely right. Perspective and optimism is always really important. I'm really interested from the panel, your thoughts around, I suppose, some of what you've all picked up to some extent around the sort of tensions that can exist between, I guess, as you've said, David, the social, the kind of ideological, the political, and you've all pointed to things that give us hope that we're moving forward in the right direction. But there's clearly, in talking about those issues, risks and threats, associated with some of those issues that you've discussed. And I just wondered whether anybody would like to offer any reflections on the risks and the threats to those changes that you've identified are starting to happen or that you anticipate are going to happen with the shifts that you've explained. Would anybody like to go first?
I think I would start off with maybe a very practical observation. What David has alluded to is that obviously there have been some policies that have been introduced because they've been mandated. And where I see the optimism is that if organizations are dismantling those policies, there may also be because the policies weren't fit for purpose anyway. Maybe they weren't embedded in the organization properly, weren't being followed properly. So there's no point and there's no benefit of adhering to something that's really quite bad. So if there can be something that will help sort of replace that and look at it more holistically, and as you say, not just have it perhaps that it's a quota driven for women, but just for more active inclusion amongst plenty of minority groups or other groups that need extra support in the workplace, then I am all for that. But where maybe I think then there's another threat that's coming in is that you perhaps see a lot of noise being heard about return to office and return to office agendas. Now, I think we've managed to overcome the original shock of all having to work from home during the COVID times. What that did introduce was that actually there was an acknowledgement from employers to employees that there was an element of trust that yes, you could be trusted to do your work regardless of what environment that you were working from and regardless of what other commitments that many people had to deal with in the same working day environment. I think what you're hearing now also then is that there's this insistence on returning to work and there's plenty of reasons, within an organization as to why that might be necessary and relevant and it's appropriate for them. But what I would also then like to see is that retaining that little bit of balance and that flexibility so that to allow individuals that have other commitments, extra responsibilities, whether in the workplace or at home, that they're able to maintain that balance between the office and the home environment continuing to encourage that flexibility so that people can continue to thrive in their workplace.
Thank you, Leontia. Julia, I think you wanted to step in and say something.
Yes, like 1,000 thoughts. So, so I think I'm hearing from people in America saying that it's not all being dismantled. There's a lot of organizations that aren't dismantling things, and there are some organizations that are relabeling things because they need to please certain people in government at this particular political moment. So I'm not denying that there isn't a serious threat, but I think that we should be really careful not to escalate that threat. And each of us whose values buy into this need to be standing up in rooms and saying we have not lost the room, that our values are retained. And this is really a moment for people to stand up and for voices to be heard. And reflecting on what Leontia and David have said about the disruption of quotas, for example, as an example. Some of the critique that's being made of DEI is about there not being enough evidence is probably true. And then on the other hand, there hasn't been enough investment in creating evidence-based programs in the first place, and then evaluating how they work. That's not the fault of DEI. That's not the fault of the minoritized people that we're talking about or of women. If organizations have put in weak interventions where they've just taken something like a quota and used it like a hammer, that's not the fault of women, because it's clearly a complex issue. In a situation like that, you have to ask yourself, as David said, how this has come about. How has women's talent not ended up in that room? Sometimes you'll need to promote on potential in order to have an acceleration of advancement. And that means that you have to do two things. That is, start to value things that you weren't valuing before. Valuing approaches that a woman might bring into that room without wanting to stereotype women at the same time, or indeed men. But you might want to change the culture in the room. You might want to recognize some things that are really valuable, but not highly valued, and really think about that. But you also might want to take people on a really intentional progression pathway, because it's not fair to put people into the room who don't know how to behave in the room because they've never been in the room. Okay, that exposes them, and it tends to be that an awful lot of light is then shone on that person. If it doesn't work out, then whatever group they've come to typify is then, the idea that they should be in the room comes even further to come across that they don't belong. So there's real dangers to these kinds of approaches, and they can't be approached without broader training, thinking, and development work. So we do need broader organisational change, and for people to get together and to enter in some of the complexity of this work in order that it does work. And the real thing I think we need to stand up against is just saying it hasn't worked, let's abandon it. In any case, very thankfully in the UK, you can't do that anyway, because we've got a legal framework that says you have to do a load of things. And I don't think we're in any danger of losing that quickly. So, and if we do, by the way, we must all be out on the street and make sure, because, you think about the women who pioneered for maternity policy, etc. There may come a day when, ladies, we have to get back on the street about that. I think it is really a time for people to raise their voices at this time. At the same time, though, as entering into some really complex problem solving.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Julia. David, I feel like I'm going to put you on the spot here. But I know from previous conversations that what I'm going to ask you about is something you've commented on before and feel quite strongly about, which is advocacy of men around these issues. That, the women issues that we're talking about are not to be solved by women, and that actually it's not a zero-sum game. And if we address these issues that we're talking about, and if we mitigate against the threats that have been already highlighted in our conversation that actually everybody benefits. And I just wondered if you would want to speak to that a bit.
Yeah, and this is about being an active ally for me, and it's not a woman problem. It's not a woman solution. It's a global problem. It's a humanity issue, and for me, we talk. We can say a lot of words, but words are just words. We need to bring them to life. We need to give them meaning. They're only words till we give them meaning. Then we have to take action. And, I hear a lot of people, Iwi, talking about, I'm all for women equality. And I'll always say, so what have you done about it?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I don't stand in anyone's way, and you'll get the usual retort. But, what activism are you actually putting forward? What are you doing? What have you got to offer? When did you stand up when you saw something, and did something? When did you challenge something? And for me, Iwi, I think this almost comes back to Julia's comment just now about culture. And, we have this masculine, this alpha male culture, particularly in business, that is strong and ruthless. And it's been strong and ruthless for a while. And we're seeing that actually come back, So for me, culture is only as good as the worst behavior you're willing to tolerate. And if you see that behavior here, but actually you don't address it, it creates a vortex for everything to swim towards. It's like, it's okay. You've just set the lowest bar in your business. So for me, the advocacy comes back to high level sponsorship. It has to be absolutely at the top, all the way down. It can't be somewhere sort of towards the bottom. That's where the advocacy starts and we try and infiltrate it up the way. It's got to start absolutely at the top, and don't tolerate poor behavior. And that for me is absolutely critical. So I'm not going to bang on about poor leadership, because that's where I'll go next. But in terms of modern day leadership, it is more than just profit and loss accounting. It's more than just a return on investment for your shareholder. It's so much more around the sustainability of your business. Is it fit for purpose tomorrow when you leave it after a 5-year tenure at the top of the tree? It's so much more. What is your legacy with this business and this world? We're here for a short time. If we live to 82, I think we have something like 30,000 days on this planet. Make them count.
Absolutely.
No, but I actually just want to step in a little bit and touch upon something you said, David, where you think it can't be from the bottom up and it needs to come from the top down. I'd actually temper that a little bit and say actually it has to come from both angles. So definitely coming from the top down, but I would say certainly from experience, anybody at an entry level of the organization or the junior level, so to speak, the wider end of a pyramid in the workplace, they're driving change and they've become really valued focused. So they certainly see this as an agenda item. And for employees then that are invested in the values, there's statistics and the reports do suggest that actually that drives retention, it drives profitability of organizations. So I say it needs to be actually bottom up, top down, for the two to meet in the middle and have the optimum.
And I totally agree with you, Leontia. I think you're absolutely right. I think the next generation of people coming through probably have a greater sense of social justice. They probably are less infiltrated with the ideology that perhaps I grew up with, with people around me. So I agree that it is definitely bottom up, top down. But at the end of the day, if you don't have somebody setting the pace in your business, that bottom up can't go as fast as we would like. So I totally agree with you, and 100%.
Could I come in and say two things? One is I completely agree with you about young people, but we've also got a minority of young men who are adopting quite extreme attitudes. And so that comes back to David's point, I think, about not tolerating that. I think organisations are in a place where they need to give some clear indication of actually what you can't say at work, and being actually very, very, very clear about that, pulling people up so that that is not coming into our workplaces. Women are not having to put up with that over coffee. But the other thing I would say to both of you is that we're using, in one of the projects I'm working on, we're using from complexity theory, this idea of organizations are complex. No leader can see every corner or control every corner of their organization. They're kind of very complex machines, aren't they, organizations? There are two forms of leadership. So adaptive leadership are the people who are doing the adaptations, and anyone can be an adaptive leader. You don't have to be in a leadership position to come up with an idea, talk to other people about an idea, to change your own practice. Your enabling leaders are your more senior leaders at every level of the organization, but people have some leadership who do a few things. They give legitimacy to that adaptation. They get the barriers out of the way of that adaptation. They shine a light on and sponsor that adaptation. And they also keep an eye on which bits of those adaptation are working, and they only roll out into the mainstream that which is the most effective. So there's sort of different forms of leadership here, but you need both to change a complex system. And that's the kind of ideas that I'm trying to work on in projects at the moment.
And one thing I would say on that, Julia, totally agree, is that leadership is situational. So somebody says, what type of leader are you? Well, it depends. I'll be a different leader for a different situation, circumstance. So it's those leaders that can sort of like move and change with what's required, who are the future for me. But, that's my opinion.
Well, and I think that, going back to this issue of putting some boundaries around what people can say at work, on the one hand, we're saying bring your whole self to work, and we're trying to be sort of these transformational leaders. And yet, on the other hand, some things really aren't okay to say at work. And we need to, at that point, to move into, I would say, a bit more transactional leadership, where we're saying, no, these are the rules, and being very, very clear with people. And it's whether or not people, it's a skill, isn't it? It's a flexibility to be able to move from you kind of encouraging and empowering people, and yet on the other hand, setting up the boundaries. And that's the sort of thing that I think organizations need to invest in, the fact that that is a set of skills that not everybody has, and that they need to know that they're going to be supported when they use those skills as well. So we need the broader context to empower them to feel that they've got the legitimacy to behave in that way.
Oh, fascinating conversation. Thank you all so much. And just ending on your point, Julia, around boundaries and setting the tone. I think that the next question that we're kind of going to move into is lived experience. And the panel had asked me to make a contribution as a Black woman to my thoughts around this. And I am going to say a bit about safety. I think a challenge that organisations have is how we disagree well, right? In organisations, we have communities of people who have divergent views. And as much as I want my leaders to be value-led, and it's easier for me if they align to my social justice principles, I have to accept that there are people who will think very differently to me. And what does that look like in the workplace? But particularly as a Black woman, as I'm going to come on to, safety is paramount to me, So yeah, as I say, we're kind of going to move into a conversation around lived experience, and I'll kick things off. A lot of the issues that we've spoken about already in terms of women issues are certainly issues that, I completely relate to. I've suffered miscarriage. I've gone through IVF. I'm lucky enough to have 2 kids that experienced a lot of those issues and what that felt like, not having systems of support to lean into to help with that. I think embodying a Black body means that I do have unique experiences or the impact of particular things do play out slightly differently. I think one of the challenges, and I don't speak for all Black women, obviously, I'm just from my perspective. But, you know, I know from sisters, from friends, that there's a sense of objectification that can come with embodying a Black body, and also kind of racial oppression that we face through microaggressions and various things that happen in our everyday life that you just carry with you into the workplace. So you're always on edge, stepping into spaces. What will this person think of me? How do they perceive me? What am I going to be faced with? And it is cognitive gymnastics, and it is exhausting. And I think we're talking about accelerating change. And for me, I think if you were to ask Black women employees in your organisations what they expect, actually, their expectations at this stage are probably pretty low. I think what we need are systems of care and support, as I say. I think that one of the things we don't measure is what I would call the kind of race battle fatigue that Black women encounter. And as I say, I think it's a priority that we kind of feel safe and that we have access to opportunities. So as I think it was David mentioned before, investment in Black women, and this idea that effort and talent is not enough. We need opportunity and we need investment, right? We need sponsors, we need mentors, but you need to be intentional about the networks, about the schemes, the opportunities that you are promoting and giving Black women access to. I think in terms of safety, sort of exploring opportunities for co-creation of spaces of support, resourcing employee resource groups, for example, who might want to, you know, take that forward. I think that is hugely important. But I think you also need to acknowledge that Black women need to rest, right? There has been a lot that has gone on. And as I say, a lot of people are carrying with them. And for some of them, they just want to step back. And they don't want that to be used against them, as I say. Check in with people. I mean, this is good practice for everybody, right? We're all human when it comes down to it. And just check in with people, ask if they're okay, you know, because I know that when the race riots were going on, for example, I was talking to friends, family, and it was a lot. And it's not just for our community, for everybody. But, you know, just that practice of checking in with people and making sure that they're okay, I think is really important. And I come back to data. And one of the things I think about a lot is kind of, as I'd said before, how data is being used to tell particular stories. And it's extractive, and it can be used to tell a story that organisations want to tell that's not always in the best interests of the communities that you think you're supporting. So, you know, taking care with those stories and not exploiting the minoritized in your organisation. So you put them forward and say, oh my gosh, look, the work is done. These people are successful, so the work is done. You know, that is really harmful, as I say. And finally, I'd just end by saying, because I know we've spoken a lot about legislation and regulation, and I completely agree to a point. But what I would also say, and it comes back to my point, I suppose, about not all rights being equal, that and as a community, as a member of the Black community, I can tell you that our view of how the law protects us might be very different to other people. That, you know, that there are certain laws that don't necessarily stop transgressions happening in the workplace, doesn't stop misogyny, doesn't stop misogyny. And that the law has got a kind of history of colonial injustices. If I think about my grandparents, Windrush generation came to help rebuild Britain after the war, and then legislation was brought in that denied them access to capital, denied them access to mortgages, to property, to housing. So there is a kind of suspicion as well. So I think the best thing that everybody can do to support Black women in the workplace is exactly as everyone's talked about, you know, the relational, the relationships, the community, the activism, the looking out for your fellow person, and making sure that they're okay. And that's what I will say on that. Always got lots to say. Who would like to come in next with any comments?
Iri, let me run an idea past you and you give me some feedback, if you wouldn't mind, because that was what you've just said is really powerful and made me think a lot. I've been running this project, as you know, on race in the social housing sector, which, you know, even though it's a social housing sector, has still got a very predominantly white leadership. And we were discussing last week the concept that privilege is not having to take things into account. So you've just said very eloquent there, things that you've had to take into account when you walk into a room, when you're imagining what people think of you, when you're thinking about how you come across or what have you, and how exhausting that all is. And what I'm finding in our mentoring program is that a lot of ethnically diverse people, and particularly women, I think, have got kind of very stuck. And I'm talking to them about their very sticky floor. And the mentoring is doing a lot of work, even a whole year of mentoring, to get people unstuck before they're ready to actually take action to progress. But then I'm literally seeing people have a different light in their eyes. And it feels to me like the stuckness has come from taking so much into account for so long. I mean, those of us who've been pregnant at work, very obviously there may be people listening who have really struggled to get pregnant. So it's a privilege to be pregnant. But nevertheless, it's really flipping hard. It's hard to go maternity leave. It's hard to come back. It's really hard to juggle work with babies. It's hard sometimes as a woman in the workplace in any case. But then if you add in the difficulty of being, for example, a Black woman in the workplace, you can see how people have discounted themselves, ended up in corners where they have very poor networks, where they're not even looking for better networks. And we've done a great exercise with leaders, which really transparently shows how white their own networks are, who they turn to for advice at work, who they turn to for comfort at work. They're all white people. And so we've all come to see how these things insidiously happen. And I don't know, anyway, what do you think? Privilege is not having to take things into account.
I think you're absolutely right. And, you know, I think that thing that you spoke about before about workplaces were out there saying, oh, bring your whole self to work, right? That is just not an option for some people. And coming back to kind of the safety aspect, I think you're exactly right. There are people who have to leave, don't choose to, but have to leave parts of themselves at the door. And actually what we should be doing is trying to create conditions of safety where people can choose, they've got agency about the things that they want to bring to work. And that, as I say, that you know, if it's different, and it looks different, it feels different, it sounds different, that is fine. It's not about making room, it's about celebrating that difference, acknowledging that difference, but celebrating it. And I think people with privilege don't even have to think about it. You know, it's that idea, as I say, but it's not to apologize for that. That's just the reality of people's lived experiences. Okay, I said I'd try not to do too much talking, but I have failed, so I apologise.
Can I just add something in there?
I apologise for that. Yeah, go on, David, sorry.
The answer, if you don't mind, I'll just jump in for a moment. There's a great quote that says, privilege is blind to those who have it. And, you know, I'll never know what it's like to be a Black woman, but I have lots of Black women friends. And my very good friend, Sue Liebird, she often talks about trauma tourism and how people want to tell me what it's like to be a Black woman in today's society or in financial services. And it's almost like this tourism that, and again, we have to take responsibility to educate ourselves, to understand. And the easiest way to understand it comes back to the culture debate again that Julia started earlier. You know, if you think about, you know, you walk into a company and on the wall it will say integrity. These are all our values: integrity, trustworthiness. What you truly value will be demonstrable in the workplace. You will see it, you will feel it, you will hear it, you will smell it. It will be there in front of you. And that's why we have to take responsibility from top, Leontia, from bottom, We have to bring it all together. Everybody has to play a part to say, this could be better. I like this. Why don't we stick with this? This is really good. This is demonstrable of what really matters and who we are. And it's creating that sense of belonging and community wherever you work. That's really important.
I think that's a really good point, David. What I was leading on to then, and so interesting to hear different perspectives, not just based on gender, but on ethnicity. And I think actually that's something that so many women networks and so many various International Women's Days initiatives has sort of brought about this cultural change within organizations. So maybe 15, 10, even 5 years ago, it was women knocking on the door to try and have conversations about their role, about the opportunities, about making sure that they were included in organizations as much as any other gender. But I think now that organizations become so familiar with those types of conversations that actually it has opened the door to be able to consider the diversity aspects of it. So now that you're seeing initiatives, not just based upon like women networking, etc., it's based on like ethnicity, it's based on sort of perhaps, initiatives that are needed for neurodiversity. It's parents and carers, it's family arrangements, etc. All of those aspects of what makes us so different it is now becoming part of an everyday conversation. So I really appreciate your perspective, and I think you shouldn't feel embarrassed to share your perspective. I think everybody has a story, and having that environment where everybody can share their story and experience can only help us grow and to improve.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We're hurtling towards the end. There is a question that if one of you would like to pick it up, because I think it's related to some of the things that we've spoken about. The question says, the populist movement implies that large numbers of people, men and women, aren't positively engaged with EDI. So how do we engage more people? And I suppose this comes back to, what we've spoken about in terms of the importance of culture and shift and what that actually looks like in practice. Has anybody seen or anybody got a view that they'd like to share around sort of engagement and how you bring people along with you?
You know what, I think it's tricky because I think that on the one hand, we need to double down on our values. And then on the other hand, the question rises of whether or not we should engage actively with the doubt. Maybe there's been quite a lot of unvoiced doubt. And I always think you can only really work on people if you know what they're really thinking. But on the other hand, we don't want that to create a free fall. You can behave however you like at work. So I think organizations have got, and that means every manager has got quite a challenge on their hands, I think, to be able to achieve a bit of both.
Yeah.
And where perhaps there's some really outlandish stories out there about EDI initiatives. There's quite a lot of misinformation. We need to replace that with information. So if you develop, for example, an inclusive recruitment strategy, I think you really need to explain to people what you've done and what you haven't done. So this idea that, that job is only pegged for a woman, or we have to have an ethnically diverse candidate for that job, is almost certainly untrue.
Yeah.
So we therefore need to make that very clear to people. It's almost certainly untrue because it's not legal in the UK
Yeah,
to
it's
do.
unlawful. Absolutely.
So, but in the US, they have got more positive action, as you say. It's different places. So I think fighting misinformation is a big part of the thing. But I think we need to get people to enter into an adult debate, but whilst at the same time doubling down on sort of some boundaries around the values. I don't know what other people think.
Yeah, I'll just pop in very quickly. Totally agree, Julia. I love that. And I would add by saying that I can't see what you're thinking. I don't know what you're feeling, but your behavior tells me everything.
Yeah.
That for me is critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Well, we have 2 minutes to go. So my final question before I'll close up is just one closing thought or provocation or action that you think people could take with them to inspire some change or to influence culture in some of the ways that we've spoken about. Leontia, I'll come to you first.
Oh gosh, mine is probably very simple, maybe too simple for this conversation. But I would say, certainly from any DEI perspective, about the role of growing confidence and growing your skills so that you feel as if that you're meant to be within the room, you're meant to be able to lead conversations, and with that, then that you can actually lead the agenda. So I would say, and it certainly touches upon right back to what you said at the beginning, Amy, about, well, organizations said there will be no budget for those kind of skills. So how can you develop all of that without having maybe a formal training agenda? So I would say then it is about growing your network, and that should include then like men and women in it, so that you've got this leadership, you've got the sponsorship, and you've got the mentoring from all spectrums within the organization. But there's lots of little things that you can do as well outside of that, and that's the action that I would promote. So as part of Women in Banking and Finance, we do have these what we call personal excellence programs that you can join in and listen to. And all of those sort of help deal with those minor issues that can sort of cloud your ability to perform in your role. So for example, challenging that imposter syndrome, understanding what actually is causing you to feel like that and being able to address it. Improving like your presentational skills, or maybe just even knowing how to have like an enhanced and more informative performance review conversation. All of those little minor things can just make a huge difference to how you operate with your organization, make you want to stay in it. And that's what the change I would say.
Thank you, Leontia. Thank you so much. Julia, can I bring you in quickly?
I'm wondering if people could take on the identity of a tempered radical. A tempered radical is somebody who wants to do what they can, but they want to survive in the organisation as well. And they do everything they can in their small decisions, in their everyday kindnesses, in the intelligent way in which they go about their practice to be inclusive and to use whatever power they do have to support, in this example, women.
Thank you so much.
And then every now and then, though, as well, Iwi, they go out on a limb. They go out on a limb in organised or informal collectives or on their own, and they stand up because something's very wrong. So could you take on this identity of a tempered radical?
Absolutely, the co-conspirator in everybody. Thank you so much, Julia. And finally, David, thank you.
I'll be really, really quick. I would say pay attention, and the more we are aware, the more we can control.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all the panelists. An amazing conversation. Really privileged to be part of it. Thank you all for joining us. We have reached the end. I am 1 minute over. But as I say, thank you all so much and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.